Admiral Sir John Warren took command of Royal Navy forces in North America and the Caribbean in September 1812. By the end of March 1813, he had blockaded the Chesapeake and the Delaware. On 23rd March, the Admiralty sent him orders to expand the blockade to cover all the American coast. The British objectives were to defend their trade and to end the war by economic means. Warren would soon have 10 74 gunships of the line, 30 frigates, and 80 smaller ships, which the Admiralty believed would allow him to carry out these tasks, allowing for a third of his ships being under repair and refit at any time. An attack on New Orleans would have made strategic sense, but Warren had only 2 battalions of Royal Marines, each of 6, 700 men. The British did carry out limited amphibious operations. An attack on the Delaware from 29 to 31 May resulted in the capture or destruction of over 20 ships. The US 44-gun frigates were more powerful than any of Warren's frigates, but would have stood no chance against a British 74. This meant that much of the United States Navy was trapped in harbor. In April, the USS President and Congress managed to exit Boston in fog, but had taken only a dozen prizes by September, when they returned to Newport. Much of British commerce was sailing in well-escorted convoys. In late May, the USS United States, Macedonian and Hornet tried and failed to get out of New York. James Lawrence had commanded the USS Hornet when she sailed with the USS Constitution in the cruise that resulted in the capture of HMS Java. On 24 February 1813, the Hornet encountered the brig HMS Peacock. Both ships were armed principally with carronades, which were very powerful but short-range guns, so a short-range battle ensued. As with most American naval victories in the War of 1812, they had a larger, more powerful ship going up against smaller, less powerful British opponents. In this case, it was the Hornet, which carried 32-pound carronades. The Peacock had 24-pounders. Lawrence was promoted from Master Commandant to Captain. He was initially promised command of the 44-gun frigate USS Constitution, then under refit, but this was changed to the 38-gun frigate USS Chesapeake, then at Boston. Lawrence was annoyed at being switched to a smaller ship, but the Chesapeake was ready for sea. Andrew Lambert notes that her crew was a remarkably experienced team of deep-sea mariners. Lawrence took command on 20th May and spent the next 11 days exercising his gun crews. He also replaced some of the weaker officers. He was aware that there was a British frigate off Boston, so the Chesapeake prepared for action on 31st May before sailing the next day. The British ship was the 38-gun frigate HMS Shannon, commanded by Captain Philip Brooke. He had carefully studied naval tactics, realizing the importance of accurate gunnery and skillful maneuver. His gun crews were trained to a high level of efficiency. They could target the masts to immobilize the enemy ship or the decks to kill the crew. He paid for adjustments to the guns with his own money. The decks were marked to enable every gun to concentrate fire on the same point. Brooke had sent a challenge to Lawrence to a single ship contest, a fair one-to-one contest that Americans had been avoiding during the war. Lawrence had himself challenged HMS Bon Citoyen to combat whilst commanding the Hornet, but did not receive Brooke's letter, as he had sailed before it arrived. Shannon had been accompanied by another frigate, HMS Tenedos, but Brooke, realizing that the Chesapeake would not engage 2 frigates, had detached her to guard another exit in case Chesapeake tried to slip out under cover of fog. The 2 ships were evenly balanced, so the battle would depend on skill. Shannon had 52 guns, with a broadside of 26, 28 18-pounders, 4 9-pounders, 1 6-pounder, 16 32-pound carronades, and 3 12-pound carronades. Her crew was 330, 30 of them raw. The Chesapeake had 50 guns, with a broadside of 26, 28 18-pounders firing on the broadside, and 1 ahead, 2 12-pounders, 18 32-pound carronades, and 1 12-pound carronade. Her crew was 379. The Chesapeake left Boston at 1 p.m. on 1st June, heading towards Shannon. The visibility was excellent, so both ships could see the other clearly. In previous frigate actions, the Americans had fired at long range, not closing until the enemy was badly damaged. However, the Chesapeake did not have the firepower advantage that the 44-gun U.S. frigates enjoyed. Getting in close had worked for Lawrence when the much larger Hornet had defeated HMS Peacock. Brooke did not want to fight close to Boston, where he knew U.S. gunboats might join in, so moved further away, stopping once Shannon was 15 miles away from Boston and out of sight. The Chesapeake was then 4 miles away and closing. At 5:10, Brooke spoke to his crew, encouraging them and ordering his gunners to fire into the enemy hull to kill the American gunners and destroy the guns, rather than trying to dismast her. At 5:30, it appeared that the Chesapeake might try to cross Shannon's stern, allowing her to rake the British ship, which would result in devastating damage to her hull. Brooke reacted quickly to prevent this happening, but Lawrence was probably intending to fight broadside to broadside. He had loaded his guns with ammunition suitable for destroying the Shannon's rigging rather than firing into her hull. At 5:40, the American crew gave 3 cheers, but the British remained silent. Brooke believed in fighting as quietly as possible so that orders could be heard clearly. Lawrence, assuming that he intended to use the tactics that had worked against HMS Peacock, would have aimed to destroy Shannon's lower rigging. The Chesapeake could then have sat on Shannon's quarter, firing all her broadside against only a few of the immobilized British ship's guns. Brooke moved to forestall this and brought his ship broadside to broadside with the American, 40, 50 yards apart. The British opened fire at 5:50 to devastating effect. The Americans quickly replied, but many of their gunners were already dead. The Americans scored hits on Shannon, notably on her lower rigging, but were having the worse of the battle. The Chesapeake was sailing faster, with the result that she exposed her stern to the British. Her wheel was shot away, and she suffered heavy casualties amongst her officers and petty officers. At one stage, it seemed as if the Chesapeake might escape, but she then lost way. A cartridge box exploded on her deck at 5:58. A boarding action was risky, but Lawrence realized that it was his last option. However, heavy casualties meant that few men answered his call for boarders. He was then mortally wounded, saying, "Don't give up the ship," as he fell, not knowing that his crew already had. At 6 o'clock, the ships collided, with one of the British anchors attaching itself to the American port quarter. William Stevens, the British boatswain, tied the ships together, losing an arm in the process. At 6:02 p.m. Brooke led a boarding party onto the Chesapeake. The U.S. Marines tried to resist, but 14 out of 44 had been killed and 20 wounded. Lieutenant George Budd tried to rally the American crew, but was wounded. Brooke said that the Americans fought desperately but in disorder, a stark contrast to the well-trained and well-drilled British crew. The fighting was over in a couple of minutes. However, 3 U.S. sailors, perhaps RN deserters who would be executed if taken alive, attacked Brooke, inflicting a severe head wound on him. The trio were quickly killed. Brooke fell into some quicklime, which had leaked from a barrel hit by a cannonball. It was used by the Americans as a disinfectant, and this probably saved Brooke's life. Some believe the Americans were planning on throwing it into any potential British boarder's eyes, something that would have been considered desperate and dishonourable. According to Lambert, the humiliated and dying Captain Lawrence realized that his ship had been taken and exclaimed, "Then blow her up! Blow the ship up!" The ships had now drifted apart. A small British ensign was raised on the Chesapeake, but was then lowered before a larger one was raised. This confused one of Shannon's gun crews, who reopened fire, killing George Watt, Shannon's first lieutenant, and killing or wounding 5 other British sailors. The British now held the gun deck, but there were only 70 of them, far fewer than the number of Americans below decks. The ships were less than 20 miles off the U.S. coast. Charles Falconer, Shannon's 4th lieutenant, told the Americans that there were 300 British on board, and a boat full of Shannon's Marines arrived, making the prize secure. The ships were of similar size and firepower, with the Chesapeake having the larger crew. Both had brave captains and experienced crews. The main difference was that Brooke had trained his men to be far superior to any American he could ever come across. Lambert states, "The Americans had nothing to be ashamed of. Their gunnery was good, and they fought bravely, but they were beaten by better men, perhaps the best fighting crew that ever went to sea." Theodore Roosevelt gives American casualties as 61 killed and 85 wounded, and British as 33 killed and 50 wounded. Lambert says that 48 Americans were killed, 99 wounded, and 325, including the wounded, captured. Some, probably British deserters, jumped overboard. He gives British casualties as 26 killed and 58 wounded. Shannon hit the Chesapeake 362 times and was struck 158 times in return. A lopsided affair. The two ships, under the command of Provost Wallis, Shannon's third lieutenant, were repaired before heading for Halifax, Wallis's hometown, arriving on 4th June. Lawrence died just before the ships entered harbour. Delirious, he had exclaimed, "Don't give up the ship," several times during the voyage. The Americans had claimed that their naval victories up to this point were battles of equal strength, pretending they had gone toe-to-toe with the Royal Navy. The capture of the Chesapeake showed that their victories hadn't been of equal strength at all. They were always larger ships against smaller British ones. The taking of the captured Chesapeake to Halifax served as a tremendous boost to British morale, showcasing that the Americans had been lying, and that natural order had been restored. Lawrence and Augustus Ludlow, one of his lieutenants, were buried in Halifax with full military honours, but were soon moved and reburied in first Salem, and then New York. The Chesapeake became HMS Chesapeake, and served in the RN until 1819. Brooke was made a baronet, but did not serve again at sea because of the severity of his wound, which caused him pain for the rest of his life. He was promoted to Rear Admiral on the grounds of seniority in 1830, dying in 1841. Wallis and Faulkner were both promoted to commander. Wallis, born in Halifax, Nova Scotia on 12 April 1791, was born on the books of HMS Oiseau in 1795. The importance of seniority in RN promotion meant influential fathers whose sons intended to join the RN often had them listed on the books of warships years before they went to sea. Wallis actually went to sea for the first time on HMS Cleopatra in 1805. His last sea-going appointment as C&C on the southeast coast of South America ended in 1857. However, he was technically still a serving officer until he died on 13th February 1892, by then Admiral of the Fleet Sir Provost Wallis. He was on the active list for 96 years, with 52 years of actual service, and was the last surviving British officer to have commanded a warship during the Napoleonic Wars. The capture of the Chesapeake by HMS Shannon was the bloodiest battle in the age of sail, famous for its brevity, lasting less than 10 minutes, stark difference in skill between opponents, and resulted in humiliation for the United States and a great boost to Britain during the War of 1812. After service in the Royal Navy, surviving timbers from the Chesapeake were used to build the nearby Chesapeake Mill in Wickham and can be seen and visited to this day. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel.